I told everyone at our party that my coworker was better than my BF and he destroyed my entire life. Sometimes the most devastating truths come out when everyone's watching and there's no taking them back. Make sure to hit that like button if you enjoy my stories and don't forget to subscribe if you're new here. I'm Josie. I'm 26 and I work in PR. You know what that means. I live for the buzz, the connections, the energy of being around people who actually matter. My boyfriend Alan, he's 28 and works as an architect. Look, he's good at what he does. I'll give him that. But the man has zero social awareness. Like none. He's one of those guys who thinks staying home every night sketching building plans counts as having ambitions. Don't get me wrong, he's not ugly or anything, but he's just so content. Annoyingly content. While I'm out there networking, building my career, making things happen. He's perfectly happy sitting in his little corner of the world acting like that's enough. When we first started dating, I thought his quiet thing was kind of sweet, different from the usual guys I'd been with. But after a year and a half together, that whole grounded personality started feeling more like dead weight. I mean, the guy would rather cook dinner at home than go to industry events with me. Do you know how embarrassing it is when people ask where your boyfriend is and you have to make excuses because he's at home doing whatever it is he does? That's when Felix started looking really good. Felix works with me and he gets it. He understands that success means being seen, making connections, playing the game. He's confident, ambitious, actually cares about advancing his career instead of just existing in some comfortable bubble. And yeah, we started spending more time together during those late client meetings and strategy sessions. Can you blame me? Finally, someone who could keep up with my energy. The thing is, Alan never even noticed. That's how checked out he was from my actual life. I'd come home buzzing from a great client dinner or networking event, and he'd barely look up from his drafting table to ask how it went. It was like living with a roommate who occasionally shared my bed. So, when Felix and I started getting closer, when those late work sessions turned into something more, I didn't feel guilty. I felt alive for the first time in months. Alan would do these little gestures, bring me coffee in the morning, leave sweet notes, cook my favorite meals, and I started seeing them for what they really were. Desperate attempts to keep me satisfied with his low-effort lifestyle. Like bringing me coffee doesn't make up for never wanting to go anywhere or meet anyone important. It just highlighted how small his world was, how small he wanted ours to be. Between us, I was getting tired of making excuses for him. My coworkers would invite us to things and I'd have to explain that Alan wasn't really the social type. It was humiliating. Here I am building this reputation as someone dynamic and connected. And my boyfriend is this hermit who thinks a perfect Saturday is grocery shopping and watching movies at home. When we decided to move in together, I saw it as an opportunity. Maybe being in a shared space would force him to step up, become more social, more ambitious. The apartment we found was perfect. Spacious, great for entertaining, near all the places that mattered for my career. Alan seemed happy enough about it, but then again, he seemed happy about everything. That was the problem. I suggested we throw a housewarming party, partly because I wanted to celebrate our new place, but mostly because I wanted Alan to finally meet the people from my work, especially Felix. I know that sounds weird, but I thought maybe seeing what real ambition looked like would inspire Alan to want more from life, or at least help him understand why I needed more than what he was giving me. Planning that party became my obsession. I wanted everything perfect. The food, the music, the guest list, the way our place looked. This was going to be our debut as a couple in my professional circle, and I needed it to show that we belonged in that world. Alan helped with the setup, but in that methodical way of his, that sucked all the excitement out of everything. While I was buzzing with energy about who was coming and what impressions we'd make, he was focused on making sure we had enough ice and whether the furniture arrangement made sense. The week leading up to the party, I was practically vibrating with anticipation. Felix and I had been getting closer, and I kept imagining how it would feel to have both of them in the same room, to see the contrast between Alan's suffocating contentment and Felix's electric ambition. I bought a new dress, this deep red number that made me feel powerful and desirable, and spent way more than I should have on catering and decorations. Alan covered most of it without complaining, which somehow made me more annoyed. Even his generosity felt passive, like he was just going along with whatever I wanted instead of having strong opinions of his own. The night of the party, I looked at myself in that red dress and felt incredible. When I came out of the bedroom, Alan said I looked beautiful, but he said it the same way he said everything. Quiet, understated, like he was afraid of taking up too much space, even with compliments. I wanted someone to look at me like I was the most stunning woman they'd ever seen, not like I was just nice. People started arriving around 7, and I was in my element immediately. This is what I'm good at, working a room, making everyone feel welcome while also making sure they notice how put together everything is. Alan positioned himself behind the kitchen counter, playing bartender, which was so typical. Even in our own party, he found a way to stay on the sidelines. When Felix walked in, I felt this rush of excitement that I hadn't felt in months. He looked amazing. Sharp suit, confident smile, the kind of presence that makes everyone turn to look. When I introduced him to Alan, I watched them shake hands and could see exactly what I'd been missing. Felix's handshake was firm, commanding. Alan's was polite. That's the difference between them in a nutshell. Throughout the night, I found myself gravitating toward Felix. We had so much to talk about: work projects, industry gossip, plans for the future, real conversations about things that mattered. Meanwhile, Alan stayed behind that counter, filling glasses and making small talk with whoever wandered over to him. A few times, I caught him watching me and Felix, and I could tell something was bothering him. But instead of coming over and joining our conversation like a normal boyfriend would, he just stayed in his corner looking wounded. Around 10, when the party was really hitting its stride, Alan pulled me aside in the hallway. His voice was quiet, controlled, but I could hear the tension underneath. "You're being pretty obvious with Felix," he said. I felt my defenses go up immediately. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You know exactly what it means. You've barely talked to anyone else tonight." The fact that he was right made me even more annoyed. Maybe if you came out from behind that counter and actually participated in our party, I wouldn't have to entertain everyone by myself. "Josie, you're flirting with him in front of everyone." "I'm being social. You should try it sometime instead of hiding back there like you're afraid of your own guests." He looked at me for a long moment and I could see him trying to decide whether to push the issue. That's what he always did. Back down instead of fighting for what he wanted. It was so weak. "Fine," he said finally, "but people are starting to notice." "Let them notice. Maybe they'll see what actual chemistry looks like." I walked away before he could respond, and I could feel his eyes on me as I rejoined Felix near the balcony. The truth is, I was enjoying the attention Felix was giving me. The way he leaned in when I talked, how his laugh was loud and confident. Everything about him was the opposite of Alan's careful, contained way of existing in the world. By midnight, I'd had several glasses of wine and was feeling bold. Felix and I were standing by the couch, and he just made some joke about our latest client when I felt Alan appear beside us. "Josie," Alan said quietly. "Can we talk?" "We're in the middle of a conversation," I said, not even looking at him. "It's important." Something in his tone made me turn around. He looked serious, more serious than I'd seen him in months. The party was still going strong around us, but I could sense people starting to pay attention to our little drama. "What's your problem?" I asked loud enough that a few people nearby turned to look. "My problem is that you're embarrassing both of us." That's when something inside me snapped. Here he was calling me embarrassing. When he was the one who'd spent the entire night acting like a servant instead of a partner. When he was the one who never wanted to go anywhere or do anything that might advance our lives beyond his comfortable little bubble. You want to know what's embarrassing? I said, my voice getting louder. Having a boyfriend who's so weak he can't even handle his girlfriend talking to other people. Josie, stop. But I was done stopping. I was done pretending that his passive, unambitious approach to life was enough for me. I was done making excuses for why he never wanted to grow or change or be more than what he was. You know what your problem is, Alan? You're pathetic. You make everything feel like a chore. You never want to do anything, go anywhere, be anyone important. The room was getting quieter around us. I could see people starting to stare, but I didn't care. Let them see who we really were. You think because you're quiet and stable that makes you some kind of catch. That's not love, Alan. That's just existing. Lena, he said quietly, and I could hear the hurt in his voice. This isn't the place. Why not? Everyone should know the truth anyway. And that's when I said it. The thing I'd been holding back for months. The reality that had been burning inside me every time he touched me with those careful, gentle hands. Every time he looked at me like I was something precious instead of something to be conquered. Yes, we're sleeping together, I announced, pointing at Felix. He's better than you. Get out. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear someone's drink hit the floor. Could see Felix's face go pale with shock, but I felt incredible. Finally, I'd stopped pretending. Finally, I'd told the truth about what I needed, what I deserved. Alan didn't yell. He didn't throw anything or make a scene. He just looked at me for a moment with this expression I couldn't quite read. Then he picked up his wine glass, raised it slightly, and said, "To honesty." He set the glass down, and walked toward the door. Just like that, no big dramatic speech, no begging, no fighting for me. Even his exit was disappointingly passive. He needed to hear it, I called after him, my voice cracking slightly, but he didn't turn around. The party pretty much ended after that. People started making excuses and leaving, giving me these uncomfortable looks like I'd done something wrong instead of finally being honest about my life. Felix left, too, mumbling something about it being late and having work in the morning. Even he seemed shaken by what had happened, which was annoying. I'd expected him to be proud of me for finally choosing him, for finally being brave enough to go after what I really wanted. I spent that night alone in our apartment, surrounded by empty glasses and leftover food, replaying the whole scene in my head. Part of me felt vindicated. I'd finally stopped living a lie, stopped settling for Alan's suffocating version of love. But another part of me felt this weird emptiness, like something important had just ended, and I wasn't sure what came next. The next few days were strange. Alan didn't come back to the apartment, didn't call or text. I figured he was staying with Brandon or one of his other friends, licking his wounds, and probably getting sympathy for having such a terrible girlfriend. When I tried calling him, it went straight to voicemail. When I texted, there was no response. I thought Felix would reach out, maybe suggest we grab dinner and talk about what happened, but he was weirdly distant at work. When I tried to bring up the party, he changed the subject. When I suggested we get drinks after work, he said he was busy. It was like he was suddenly uncomfortable with the whole situation, which made no sense. I'd chosen him. I'd blown up my relationship for him. The least he could do was acknowledge that. By the end of the week, I was getting frustrated with everyone's reactions. My friend Lindsay called and basically lectured me about how I'd handled things, saying I'd humiliated Alan in front of everyone and that it was cruel. Even she didn't seem to understand that I'd been suffocating in that relationship, that I'd needed something more than Alan's careful, contained love. You could have broken up with him privately, she said. You didn't have to destroy him like that in front of everyone. But that's not what I'd done. I'd finally been honest about what I needed, what was missing from our relationship. If Alan couldn't handle the truth, that was his problem, not mine. Work became uncomfortable, too. People who'd been at the party started treating me differently. Not hostile exactly, but careful, like they weren't sure what I might say or do next. Felix was the worst of all. He started avoiding me completely, taking meetings I wasn't included in, eating lunch at different times. When I finally cornered him in the break room and asked what his problem was, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. Look, Josie, what happened at your party? That was intense. I think maybe we should cool things down for a while. Cool things down. I ended my relationship for you. I never asked you to do that. And the way you did it, that was pretty harsh even for someone who was unhappy. I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. This was the man I'd risked everything for, the one who'd made me feel alive again after months of Alan's suffocating stability. And now he was backing away because I'd had the courage to choose him publicly. You're kidding me. I just think we both need some space to figure out what we want. What I wanted was for him to stop being a coward. What I wanted was for someone to finally appreciate that I'd been brave enough to go after what I needed instead of settling for what was comfortable. But looking at Felix's face, I could see that wasn't going to happen. The next few weeks were a blur of awkward work interactions and an increasingly empty apartment. Alan had somehow managed to get his things out while I was at work. No confrontation, no final conversation, just empty closet space and gaps where his books used to be. He'd even arranged for his name to be taken off the lease without talking to me directly. Everything handled through lawyers and property managers like I was some kind of dangerous person he couldn't risk seeing again. I started telling people my version of what had happened. That Alan and I had been growing apart for months. That I'd been unhappy and he'd been emotionally unavailable. That the party had just been the final breaking point in a relationship that was already over. Some people seemed to buy it, but others, especially the ones who'd been there that night, looked at me skeptically. The worst part was how everyone seemed to think I should feel guilty about the whole thing. Like I was supposed to apologize for finally being honest about what I needed, for refusing to stay trapped in a relationship that was slowly killing my spirit. Alan had never been enough for me. Not ambitious enough, not social enough, not passionate enough, and I'd finally had the courage to admit it. If that made me the villain in everyone else's story, fine. At least I was being real. But Felix never came back. 3 months after the party, I heard through office gossip that he'd started seeing someone else. A woman from the marketing department who was apparently everything I wasn't. Quieter, more reserved. The kind of person who probably thought staying home every night was romantic instead of suffocating. It was like he'd learned nothing from our connection. Like he decided to settle for the same kind of boring relationship I just escaped from. Then I started hearing things about Alan. Brandon mentioned that he'd started his own architectural firm, that he was doing really well for himself. Someone else said they'd seen him at a gallery opening with a woman, a lawyer, apparently, someone successful and confident. The idea of Alan with someone new bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Not because I wanted him back, but because it seemed so unfair. He was the one who'd been content with mediocrity, who'd never wanted to grow or change. How was he suddenly thriving while I was struggling to rebuild my life? The worst blow came 4 months after everything fell apart. My boss called me into her office and told me they were restructuring my position. Apparently, some of our clients had been asking questions about my professionalism and judgment, and the company felt it would be best if I moved on. They offered me a severance package and 3 weeks to clean out my desk. Sitting in that office, listening to her explain how my personal life had become a liability to the company, I felt something crack inside me. This wasn't fair. I'd worked harder than anyone, brought in more clients than half the people in that office. But because I'd had the courage to end an unsatisfying relationship publicly because I'd refused to keep living a lie, I was being punished. Felix got my accounts. Felix, who'd been too much of a coward to stand by me when I'd chosen him over Alan, was now benefiting from my downfall. The irony was almost too much to handle. I had to move back in with my parents. At 26, with a successful career that had suddenly evaporated, I was back in my childhood bedroom trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong so fast. My mom kept making these passive-aggressive comments about how maybe I should have handled things differently with Alan, like she didn't understand that I'd been suffocating in that relationship. Taking a job at a local retail store was humiliating, but I needed income. While I figured out my next move, every day felt like a step backward, like I was being punished for finally being honest about what I wanted from life. Meanwhile, I kept hearing updates about Alan through mutual friends. His business was growing. He seemed happy. He was apparently in a serious relationship with that lawyer. The final blow came 8 months after the party. I was working a particularly soul-crushing shift when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but when I answered, I heard a woman's voice. "Hi, is this Josie? This is Rebecca. I'm calling on behalf of Alan. He asked me to let you know that if you continue trying to contact him, we'll need to involve lawyers. He's moved on, and he'd appreciate it if you'd respect that." I'd only tried calling him a few times, mostly when I'd had too much wine and started thinking about how unfair everything had become. But hearing his new girlfriend's voice, so calm and professional, telling me to stay away from him, felt like the ultimate humiliation. "Tell Alan I said congratulations," I managed to say before hanging up. Standing there in that store, surrounded by clearance racks and fluorescent lighting, I finally understood what had happened. I'd gambled everything on the idea that I deserved more than what Alan was offering, that I was brave enough to go after what I really wanted. But instead of finding something better, I'd lost everything. My job, my apartment, my relationship, my self-respect, all of it gone because I'd refused to be satisfied with a man who loved me exactly as I was. The truth is, Alan had never been the problem. He'd been stable, loyal, generous, patient with all my moods and demands. He'd supported my career, covered my expenses, made our home a place where I felt safe and cared for. But I'd convinced myself that his quiet love was somehow less valuable than Felix's flashy attention. That his contentment was weakness instead of strength. Now Felix was thriving in the job that used to be mine. Alan was building a successful business with a woman who apparently appreciated what I'd thrown away. And I was living with my parents, wondering how I'd managed to destroy the best thing in my life for something that had never been real in the first place. I still don't regret being honest about what I wanted. I still think Alan could have been more social, more ambitious, more exciting. But lying here in my childhood bed, scrolling through social media posts of his architectural awards and her law firm achievements, I have to admit that maybe I was wrong about what actually mattered. Maybe I was wrong about